Hello everyone and welcome to today's tutorial, and in this one I'm going to be showing you how to use AJAX in your Django applications. Now AJAX stands for Asynchronous JavaScript and XML, and it's just a technique to make part of your web page communicate with the web server asynchronously without having to do a full page reload. Now what does all those jargons I just popped out actually mean? A very simple example of AJAX in action is in an app like Facebook. Whenever you hit the like button on a Facebook post, it doesn't trigger a full page reload. Instead, that like button sends data to the server, and once the server is done with the like action, it sends back the results and the web page is updated without having to do a full page reload. The same thing happens for a Facebook comment. Whenever you add a comment to a Facebook post, it doesn't have to do a full page reload. One of the main benefits of using AJAX in your applications is to promote user experience. The examples I just gave are common scenarios whereby you wouldn't want a full page reload. AJAX consists of different technologies that work together to achieve this. On the presentation side, we have HTML and CSS. Then JavaScript is used to communicate with the web server and to also update our web page. There are various ways we could add AJAX to our website. We could use the jQuery library to do this. We also have the XMLHttpRequest, XHR for short, which could be used to perform AJAX operations in our web app. But for this tutorial, we'll be using a more modern and recent approach, which is the Fetch API. And the Fetch API simply allows you to make network requests. It is quite similar to the XMLHttpRequest, but it uses JavaScript promises, which gives us a cleaner API for handling asynchronous code. For this tutorial, we'll be using the project from my Django class-based view course, which is available on my YouTube channel. It is just a simple blog app, all created with Django class-based views. And for this, we'll be AJAXifying the comments form. So now, whenever you add a comment, it does a full page reload, like so. But we'll be changing this operation to use AJAX. And this detail view is quite simple. On the Django side, we have the post detail view, which extends the view class-based view. I separated the get and the post actions into two different views. For the get action, we have the post display view, and for the post action, we have the post comment view. The post display view is very straightforward. It is just a view that returns a single post, the form, and the underlying comments. If you are familiar with class-based views, you would understand this code. Else, go ahead and watch my course. In this tutorial, we'll be working with the post comment form because this is the view that handles submitting the form. Now, to AJAXify a Django functionalities, you do it in 3 steps. The first step is to prepare your view and return the data. For this view, we'll be returning JSON data. Now you might be wondering, why not XML? Well, when working with AJAX, you are not limited to work with only XML. The more common and modern approach is to use JSON, and that's what we'll be doing in this video. After you're done returning the data, the second step is to make a part of your web page communicate with the server. This would be done with JavaScript. And once that is successful, the third and the final step is to update your user interface. In this case, we'll be appending the response from the server as the new comments. So let's dive into the Django view and return a JSON data. I'll add the following imports. Over here, I imported the JSON response class, which is going to be responsible for returning a HTTP response in JSON format. And secondly, I imported serializers, which contains interfaces for serializing Django objects to different data formats. Next, I will update my class to return JSON data. Over here, I checked if the request is an AJAX request. because we want to return JSON if it's only an AJAX request, and we'll be implementing this from our front-end code later on. Next, I assigned the saved instance to a new variable called new comment, and I then serialized it into JSON format. In this case, I passed in two arguments for the serialize method. The first argument is the format to serialize the Django model tool, and the second argument is the instance. Now you might be wondering why I actually put this in a list. So the second argument by default always accepts an iterator, and a query set is a very good example of that. But in this case, we just want to serialize a single instance, so that is why I put it inside a list, which is also an iterator. And finally, we return the JSON response of this serialized comment and a status of 200, which signifies an OK response. Then else, that is, if it is not an AJAX request, we can now return this JSON response stating that the error occurred during request. And I think I'll update this to comment instance. And let's also add the form invalid method. So if this is an AJAX request, then you return the errors of the form, and you can see form.errors. And if it's not, you send this message. And finally, over here, if you notice the get success URL, we won't be using this method in this case since we would not be redirecting to any URL. So I'm gonna comment this out, or I could completely delete it since we won't be using it. So now that we're done with the first step, let's go ahead and implement the second step, which is making a part of our web page communicate with the web server. And in this case, it's going to be this comment form. So for that, we're going to be using JavaScript. And over here in my base.html file, I'm going to be adding a JavaScript block. So this block is going to be used to add JavaScript code in our post detail page. So let's head over to the post detail template, and you can see it's a very simple template over here which extends the base.html file which we just added this JavaScript block to. So this template is very straightforward. We have the post detail, we have the form, and we also have the comment list, which is this section over here. So let me add the JavaScript block. So since we're going to be working with this form, we need to get it in our JavaScript code and also create the methods that's going to be sending this data to our server. So let's do that now. So over here, we get the HTML form by its ID, and we assign it to this variable called comment form. And this ID was assigned when I added it over here to the form. So in JavaScript, whenever you want to work with the HTML element, you need to get it either by its ID or by its class name or any other unique identifier. Then we added an event listener to the comment form, and this event is the submit event. So this code is going to be watching for whenever this form is submitted. So whenever this form is submitted, this method will be called. So the next thing to do would be to create this submit comment method, and I'll do that right now. So the submit comment method is very straightforward. First, we call the prevent default method, which prevents the default action of this form to be triggered. And the default action of this form is to send this form to the server, which would prompt a page reload. So using this E, which stands for events.prevent default, prevents the default behavior of this form, which is to submit this form and do a full page reload. So with this, we are already preventing the full page reload. And this event object is always passed to the callback function of any event listener. So the event listener sends the corresponding events to this callback function, and that is why we have it here. So the next thing I did was to get the contents text area, and I got it by using document.querySelector. Then I passed in the ID of this text area. You could actually use query selector, or you could use get element by ID, whichever one you want. But when you use query selector, you have to put the £sign because it works for both classes and IDs. So the way I got this ID content is that Django added this ID to this form, because if you see over here, we are generating this form as paragraphs. So to show you what I mean, right click on this content text area and you do inspect. And you can see the ID over here. It has the ID underscore content. For form IDs, it is prepended with the ID underscore, then the model field name. So in this case, contents. So that was how I got that. So the reason I got that was because I wanted to do a check. So I want to only create a comment when this text area is not empty. So I'm checking over here. If there's a content, do this, else prevent the user from submitting. So now over here, we could actually put a message in the UI, but I'm just using a console.log statement for now. So if I save this and try this out, let me do a page reload and try this out without entering anything. And I open up my console by pressing Ctrl+Shift+J. Create comments is not defined. Okay, let me comment this out for now. And do a page reload. Then I click on submit. And we cannot see this because if you look over here, I did document.querySelector to get the text area. So currently, what it does is that it gets the text area object, because this is actually getting the DOM value, which is a document object model. So to get the actual value of this content text area, we have to call .value. I missed that out. So I'll save this one more time and do a page reload. Then I'll try to submit the form, and you can see the message over here. You cannot submit an empty form. So currently our logic works, and if you notice, the page doesn't reload to show you that we can actually control our forms without having to do a full page reload. So I'll close this out for now. So now, if there's a content in our text area, what should we do? We should get the form data. The form data of what? The comment form, which is this total form, which is this complete form over here. So the form data API is a browser API that helps you get forms in your JavaScript code. So with this now, we can now pass this form data to the create comment method. So you'd see the advantage of this. So the main benefit of using this form data class is that if you did not use something like this and you had a form of probably 5 text fields or 12 text areas, you'd have to be getting individual HTML elements. But with this, it's just going to get all the whole contents of the form, and we can submit it all at once. So this is a shorter form for actually doing this. So the next thing to do is to create the create comments method, and I'll do that now. And it is inside this method we're going to be actually communicating with the server. Now you might be asking why I made this different. This is just separation of consent. So I'm going to be using fetch in this video. So tomorrow, if I decide to use Axios or I decide to use some other HTTP library, we'll just be updating this function instead of updating it from here. So you can actually implement this code inside here, but I won't be doing that for this. That is why I separated it into a different method. So the create comment method is going to be using the fetch API to actually send this data to the server. So I'll implement the code right now. Inside this function, we're using the fetch method to communicate with the server. So for this, we pass in the URL. So in this case, we're using the post detail URL, and we're passing the primary key of the post as its argument. So what this means is that it means that this same page should process this form. So you can see over here, you have post/13, which is the primary key, and that is what we are doing here. And the reason we have access to use this Django template tag is because we are actually inside the Django templates. So you can see over here, we have access to the post being sent from the view. So we can actually call post.pk, which is going to be passing the current primary key. And for using fetch, you have to pass in the method. The default method is get, which gets data from the server. But in this case, we are actually posting data to the server. So we use the post method. And the body of this request we're going to be passing is the form data. So it's going to be this content over here, the content of this form. So if we had multiple inputs in our form, if we had contents, date, time, and all those things, it's going to be passed as the form data, which is what we are getting over here. So the fetch method returns a promise, and you can see over here we are chaining different functions to process different parts of this promise. The first thing that's going to be happening is that if this promise resolves, that means if this promise is successful and it returns the required data, it is going to be processing this first block. So the then function is used to handle resolved promises. So in this case, the return data, which is what it returned from the view, which is going to be JSON. In this case, it won't be JSON. The response is going to be plain text. So by default, you might be thinking that the data it is going to return is JSON, but the way fetch works is that it's going to be returning a plain text. So we can convert this response to text, JSON, blob, and different types. But for this case, we are converting it to JSON and we are returning it. So this stuff is called promise chaining. So this JSON method is going to return another promise. So from there, we return it to this next block. And this is where the actual data is going to be. And you can see over here, we now have the data. So inside here, we can do different things we want to do. We can get this data and append it to this comment list and do whatever. But for now, we are currently just logging it out to the console. Then if these two blocks, if this block is not successful, what happens? The catch block would be called. So this is just like try catch from your normal programming or from Python if you use try catch block. So you can see now the catch block is going to be called, which is going to be handling the error. So if the promise does not resolve, if the promise rejects, so if something is wrong with probably our URL or we passed in the wrong form data or something, this block is going to be executed. So for this case, we're just going to be logging out the error to the console. We could append an error message to the user interface, but we won't be doing that for now. So the next thing to do here is, since we're working with Django, if you work with Django forms normally, you have to submit the form with the CSRF token. But currently, we are using AJAX, and we are not going to be using the default Django engine to submit this form. We're going to be handling it in our JavaScript code. So we need to pass the CSRF token, and lucky enough, we're in the post detail page, and we can actually get the CSRF token from the form. So to do that, I'm going to get the value of this CSRF token from the form. So if we right click on this and inspect this element and we scroll up to the form, you can see we have the CSRF token over here, CSRF middleware token, and you can see the string over here. So I'm going to be getting this and also passing it to the fetch method to submit to our Django backend. I'm going to be getting this name of this input type, and it's hidden. That's why you can't see it in our user interface. So I'm going to update my code to the following. So over here, we get the CSRF middleware token with the document.getElements by name. Notice the S over here. Previously, we've been doing get elements by ID and get and using query selector. But in this case, I'm going to be using, I used get elements by name, because you can see the name of this input field. The attribute is actually the name. You're not getting it by the ID, because you can see there's no ID over here. So the unique identifier for this input field is the name. So I'm using document.getElements by name, the CSRF middleware token. Then I return the first index, because getElements shows that it is looking for more than one element. So it's going to be returning an array. So I just need the first instance of this, or the first element it gets, which is going to be definitely this. Then I do what? I get the value. Then this value, I pass it over here as the header of the fetch method, because over here you can add extra parameters, which is what we did here. We added the method, the body, and this time around we are sending request headers. So these are going to be additional information that's going to be sent to our server to process this request. And in this case, we are passing the CSRF token, which is the value we got here. Another thing we're also passing as the header is this X requested with, and we passed in XMLHttpRequest. Now, earlier in this video, I made mention of XMLHttpRequest being the first way you could actually use to interact with your server using AJAX, but we're using fetch in this case. So Django on its backend, let me go to the view. This condition over here, if self.request is AJAX, on Django's side is actually checking if you are passing this header we have over here. It is checking if you are passing this header, this X requested with. If you have time, you can go into the request class and see this. It's just a very simple condition. If you pass this requested with, then it means it's an AJAX request. So we just pass it over here. So this is needed for this to work. And that is it for now. And if you've worked with something like Django REST framework, you'd be passing something called content type application/JSON. But in this time around, we are not going to be using that, because this is what it needs to process this request as AJAX. And we are not using that application/JSON, because if you can still see here, we are working with a comment form. We are not working with serializers. Serializers is just form for JSON data, but still in this case we are not working with serializers. We are working with our normal form. That is why we can just pass this X requested with and pass this XMLHttpRequest, and the content type application/JSON is not needed. So that's just a point to note. Working with Django REST framework, you pass application/JSON, but we're working with normal forms. So this would be it for now. So let's try it out. Let's save our work and do a page reload. Let me check. I saw something like an error. Unexpected identifier. Let's try it out first and see if it's actually sends. So I'll do, and I'll hit the submit button. See, error occurred during requests. And if we head back to our views.py, you can see, where is it? Error occurred during requests. So you can see this else block triggered to show you that this our logic is working. So now it failed because this condition is not met. That means it is not seeing it as an AJAX request. So what we have to do is to go back to this view and check for syntax error. So that time I checked that stuff, it was saying invalid. Let me do a page reload. No. Let me do a page reload, so I'll show you what. So if I scroll down, you won't see anything. So I'm gonna do Ctrl+Shift+J, and unexpected identifier, and I can already see the problem, because when we added this headers property, we forgot to put a comma. So I have to put a comma because this is the next parameter. So if I save and do a page reload, voila, you won't see that again. So let's submit this form. Let's see, and if I go to the Django admin, we have only one comment. So let me add this one. So let me say great write-up. So I'll click the submit button and nothing happens. Let's go to, oh no, before we go here, let's do Ctrl+Shift+J. And you can see posting comment to show you that this method is triggered, and you can see the object. Can you see? It returns the object, new comments. So our web page communicates with the server without having to do a full page reload. We're done with the second step. So you can see this new comment with the model, with the primary key and everything over here. So this new comment object, or this property, was what we passed over here. If you go back to our views, you can see this new comment over here. So that is it. We're making progress, and if you can see the comments here, the content states great write-up. So we have successfully communicated with our web server without having to do a full page reload. So if I come over here and reload this view, you can see my comment has been added. And that is it. AJAX is as simple as this. So the first step is to prepare your view, which is what we've done. Then the next step is to do what? Communicates with the server, which is what we just did now with JavaScript. And the last and the final step is to do what? Update your user interface. These three steps are what makes up an AJAX powered website. So even though it's for your Facebook like, or you are adding a comment on Facebook, this is still the same step. So one more thing we need to do here is to clear this form when we submit this data. So to do that, I'm gonna come over here and let's see where we're gonna be adding this. So we're going to be adding it in the success part. We're not going to be adding this over here. We're going to be adding it in this second part because this shows that our request has been successful. So we need to clear the form. So I'm going to come over here, comment form.reset, as simple as this. So I'll do page reload and come over here, and you can see our new comment is over here, but we had to do a page reload to see it. So I'm going to just see if this works. Hit the submit button and it works. Our form is cleared and you can see our comment over here. So the last step to complete the whole AJAX cycle is to do what? Update your user interface. This is what gives it the real-time appeal that makes it all cool. So for that, I'm going to look at our HTML code and see what I can actually do. So the first step to this, or the first step to updating your user interface is to look for classes and IDs of elements on your page that you can actually use to append stuff. So for this, we have the comment list div, and inside there we have a for loop. So the thing I want to append here is the new comment as the last child of this list. So I'm going to be appending to this comments list div. So we're going to make use of this. We're going to get this in our JavaScript code, and also we're going to be getting these two in our JavaScript code. So if we had no comments, we want to replace this there are no comments with the new comments we just added. But currently we can't, there's no way to get this this div tag. So what we can do here is to add a class called no comments. So the reason we are doing this is, so in case we have, let me just clear this to show you what I mean. So by default, whenever you have comments, it's just going to append it to the end of this comment list. But when you don't have any comments, just like in this case, I want to get access to this div tag so that I can replace it with a new comment. If you did not give a class name to this, there won't be any way you can actually do this. So that's just the secret, or that's just the approach to updating your user interface, which is called the document object model. So now we have the comment list. Now we have the no comments flag. The next thing to do is to actually dive straight in and append this corresponding data. So I'll update my code like so. So the first thing we did was to get the instance of this new comment, and we used the json.pass method. The pass method actually converts this string over here into JavaScript object. So with this, we can manipulate the JavaScript data in our code over here. So after we've gotten the new comments from the data object, the next thing to do is to also get the fields. In this case, we're going to be selecting the first items and selecting its corresponding fields. So the reason why we are using an index 0 over here is because in our Django code, we passed this stuff as an array. You can see it's a list over here because the serialize method actually needs a query set or an iterator. But since we are not working with a query set, we passed in an iterator, which is a list. So the first index of this stuff we are actually passing is this comment instance. So that is what we are accessing over here in our JavaScript code. So we simply select the fields of the first instance because these fields are going to be used to populate our user interface. Then next, we get the comment list from our HTML page. And for this, we use document.querySelector and we select it and we got it by the comments list class. The same thing for the no comments flag. We got it from the no comments class. So if you scroll up to our file here, you can see the comments list class, which is going to get this div tag. So we'll have access to this div in our JavaScript code. And the same thing for this no comments div. We're going to also have access to it in our JavaScript code. Then after that, the next thing we did was to check if there are no comments. If there are no comments, what should you do? You should remove this div tag over here. So it's very simple. If there are no comments and you successfully added a comment, I want to do what? Remove this div tag. Then after that, we want to do what? We want to append the new comment to this page. And we're going to be appending it where? In the comments list section. So we do comment list.innerHTML, which is going to target the content of this comment list div. And we use the JavaScript string literal or template literal to actually add the new comment. So this div tag, I copied it from the code above. So you can see everything is pretty much the same thing. But the benefit of using the JavaScript template literal is that we can interpolate or we can insert JavaScript variables inside this string without using the concatenation symbol. So for this, I'm going to be inserting what? The content field. You can see it over here. Fields, then what? Select the property what? Content. So it's going to be displaying the content in this paragraph. And I also added the user. Since this is a Django template, we simply insert the user from the request. So I'm just using user over here, which is gonna send the string representation of the user model. And for the timing, I just added just now simply because I am lazy. Because if you want to use the actual time value returned from the server, you'd have to be doing some date-time conversions to make it in a readable format. But I'm too lazy to do that now, so I'm just going to put just now. So that is simply it for this step. So I'm going to save this and come over here and do a page reload. And let's try out if this actually works. So I'm going to say cool content, man, and hit the submit button. Let's watch this section. Okay, it did not update the UI, so I'll do Ctrl+Shift+J and let me see if I have any error. So you can see cannot read property inner HTML. Inner HTML. Okay, so I'm going to change this right now. But before that, you can see the object that it returned. You can see what I just explained. The new comment is an array, but it's inside a string. That is why we are now passing it with json.pass to become a JavaScript object. And inside here, you can see it has the fields property. I don't know why can't I open this? This is a string. That is why you can see it's being truncated over here. It's a string, a JSON string. So if I go to network, and that's why you can, okay, no need for that. But if I hover over here, you can see the fields property, which is what we accessed over here in our code. And it contains different fields. You can see the content by, post, ID, created on. and you can see everything is inside a string which is inside an array. So this stuff explains the step I took over here. So now to solve this, what is it inner HTML? Let's see. To solve this, because you can see here, cannot read property inner HTML. This property is not part of the document object model methods or properties, I mean. So I think it's inner, is it inner HTML? Okay, should I check the internet? Comment list. Oh, it's correct. So the reason why it's not reading it is because of over here. When using documents.query selector, you have to add this, you have to prepend it with this icon. So if it's an ID, you prepend it with the pound symbol. If it's a class, you prepend it with what? The dot symbol. So this shows that it is a class. So I'm going to save this work, do a reload, and it's here, but I'll have to come over here and delete it first to make sure what we did actually worked. So I'll come over here and do a page reload, and if we scroll down, let me say cool contents, man. Then I'll hit the submit button. So let your eyes be on this section here. So I hit the submit button, and voila, we have it all working, and you can see everything works very, very fine. And all this happened without having to do a full page reload. You can watch over here, and the reason why there is no comment flag was deleted is because of this condition I set over here. So if the no comment flag is found in this document, what should you do? You should remove it from the comment list, because it's a child of the comment list over here. You can see it over here. It's inside the comment list div tag. So that is how to do this. So if we can go ahead and go crazy adding so many comments. So I can say nice stuff. And if you watch over here, you can see when I hit the submit button, you can see it appends it to the comment list without having to do a full page reload. So you can go crazy with this code and use it to do stuff. You can animate it in, you can do fading effects, just like how you see in Facebook. Whenever you add a comment, it fades in. So this is just the basics of using AJAX in your Django application. I hope these steps were straightforward. But to do a recap, the first step is to do what? Is to set up your views. You can see over here, previously, this view returned what? A HTTP response. But we now imported the JSON response from the Django.http file. But this time around, we are returning HTTP response in what? JSON format. So it's going to be JSON strings all through. We also checked if it's an AJAX request, and we sent the corresponding JSON response with the correct error code, with the correct status code. Same thing for form invalid. So the first step is to what? Prepare your view and send the data. The next step is to do what? Is to interact or communicate with your web server, which is what we did over here. So interacting with our web server is what we did with this first part of the fetch method, which is promise based. So over here, we can send the data using the post method and send the corresponding headers and the form data. We now have access to the data over here, and we're done with the second part. Then the third part is to do what? Update your user interface. Because let's be honest, what's the whole point of having the whole AJAX stuff in your application without having some real-time updates or instant updates? So that is what we actually did over here. We got the data returned from the server, and we updated our UI using this comments list.innerHTML. So that is how to use AJAX in your Django applications, and you can see it's pretty straightforward. You don't necessarily have to use React or Vue.js. And one point to note is that this highlighted code over here is what React actually does. because if you're working with React, you have to still use fetch API to communicate with the web server. But React now does the whole document updates. You don't have to manually, you can see over here, we are manually getting these items and appending, prepending, and doing all this whole manual stuff. But with React, we make use of a state. So whenever that state changes, the React library goes through your document and checks the corresponding components or elements that needs updating and does that automatically. You don't have to manually search for it like we did over here. So this section of code is just what React does. So since React is a front-end library, what it actually does is that it reacts to your state changes. So whenever the state in your component changes, your UI reacts by updating accordingly. So if you wanted to do something simple as this, you don't necessarily have to use React. You can actually do it with JavaScript. And this might look intimidating for beginners at first, but with time and practice, you get used to it. And one last exercise I would want you guys to try out would be to try to get these comments in this page using AJAX. I know you can do it. I believe you learned something from this. So go ahead and try that out. And that's it for this tutorial. I hope you learned something from this. If you did, hit the like button and also subscribe to my channel. And if you also want more content on Django and AJAX, please do let me know in the comment section. So thank you for watching, and I'll see you in the next one. Bye.